third time to the CDHI second lightning lunch of the year on the topic of public scholarship and knowledge mobilization, specifically within the fields of Indigenous DH and Black DH. My name is Con Vo. I am the Digital Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow at the Jackman Humanities Institute and the Critical Digital Humanities Initiative at the University of Toronto. I will be facilitating this discussion today, and we are very lucky to be joined by three wonderful scholars. First is Professor Marie Hupfield. She is a Toronto-based artist and transdisciplinary maker working with industrial felt in the intersection of performance art, design, and sculpture. She is currently the inaugural Artworks TO Legacy Artist in Residency with the City of Toronto and a Mellon Fellow at the Center for the Imagination in the Borderlands at Arizona State University 2022, which follows her inaugural Borderlands Fellowship for the project Breaking Protocol at the Verilis Center for Arts and Politics at the New School and the Center for the Imagination in the Borderlands, also at Arizona State University from 2020 to 2022. A recipient of the Natitian Mid-Career Award for Outstanding Achievement in Canada in 2018. She has exhibited and performed her work through her first major touring solo exhibition, The One Who Keeps on Giving, which was organized by the Power Plant in 2017 to 2018, and 9 Years Towards the Sun, held at the Heard Museum in Phoenix from 2019 and 2020. She has exhibited extensively, including recent projects at the Art Gallery of Ontario, the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, and in New York at the Center for Art Research and Alliance, the Bronx Museum, Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Smithsonian Institute National Museum of American Indian, and many, many other. An assistant professor and Canadian Research Chair for Transdisciplinary Indigenous Art at the University of Toronto. Maria is Martin Clan and Off-Res member of the Anishinaabe Nation belonging to the Waksing First Nation, Ontario. She is co-owner of Native Arts Department International with her husband artist, Jason Lujan, and founder of 7th Generation Image Maker, Native Child and Family Services of Toronto. So I'll pass it to Maria now.
What a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to do my best to stick to the requirement of 5 minutes. So let me get started here. What I thought I'd like to do is highlight the research that I've been doing at the University of Toronto, Mississauga campus as the Canadian Research Chair of Transdisciplinary Indigenous Arts. So I've set up a space on campus, which is called the Indigenous Creation Studio. So a way to create a space, transdisciplinary, so that it's including, most often we hear the term interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary is really getting rid of all of those silos that exist. So it could include biology, performance art, which is what I do, storytelling, all kinds of things. I teach in the Department of Visual Studies and I'm cross-appointed with English and drama. So I'm working with a range of students. I also work with master's students in visual studies. So this is the logo I've been working on. I'm currently developing a website, which will appear later this fall. And these are some strawberry plants that we've introduced to the campus. Let me see if I can, here we go. This is a group of the research team. So over the past 3 years, I'm a junior faculty member, but I'm also a mid-career artist. So I've been working with a number of different students on campus. I have a coordinator at the studio, and then you're also looking at 2 members who were part of, who are really working on land-based initiatives. And of course, our own Dr. Yvonne Sherwood, who's fantastic. So I'm trying to figure out how to, oh, here we go. So there's two projects I've been focusing on. One is the Indigenous Digital Living Archive. I'm only going to touch on that a little bit because it's all, there's not a lot of visuals to share for that, but it really is taking this idea of an archive and subverting it as an art project. So it's an online project where we're looking at objects that normally would be considered artifacts, and we're repositioning them as living and belongings. So it's a very small group of items that will be really repositioned in relation to other people, places, land, and introducing and taking up this idea of, rather than an archive being something that is, you know, we often think of it as a scholarly place where there's one template and all the objects are kind of pushed through it. We're custom designing each page for each of the belongings that will be a part of that. There's a lot of Indigenous academic stream work around the archive. So this is a little bit different because I'm a visual artist and given that transdisciplinary nature of my practice. So the other part, which I'm excited to share with you, is Mishkiki Gittigan. Mishkiki really being the word that some of you may be familiar with, but this idea of everything that grows is called strength of the earth, whether that's medicine or food. And the strength of the earth is stuff that we then bring into our bodies and gives us strength as well as connection. And then Gittigan being a term we often hear around garden. So strength of the earth garden. Initially, I had this idea that I wanted to do a community medicine garden. And that has really changed with a lot of discussions I've had with other Indigenous scholars who are working on land-based practices, as well as a range of other people. But really thinking about shifting the culture around land on campus, away from something that's there as an aesthetic into something that we have a relationship with. So these are some of our notes that we've been developing at the Indigenous Creation Studio. So last fall, we began to winter some strawberry plants and sweetgrass. We planted some corn. We've also been doing different programming on campus, including a tree medicine walk with Jewel White Duck who came. We've had some Indigenous care kits that we sent out to our Indigenous students and faculty members with some medicines. Starting to think about wanting our students to have access to medicines on campus, whether they're Indigenous or not, and also thinking about where some of these sites might be located. This summer, we also had a key gathering on Toronto Island at Gibraltar Artist Residency, where we brought together some people to talk about, for example, making pigment with plants and minerals. We've also been collecting seeds, sharing seeds, planting seeds, creating our own seeds. This is some of the corn that we've grown. So we had 3 different kinds. This is our incredible, bountiful sweetgrass harvest that came out. And then we also invited different guest speakers to come. This is Elder Jennifer, or Elder, sorry, I'm panicking, I'm running out of time. Shelley Charles, who came and shared some teachings with us around sweetgrass, including singing a song, and just really thinking about taking our time, being in conversation with people, starting to think about harvesting some of these plants that we've had and really nurturing that relationship on campus. So there's, just in closing out, we have 2 sites. One is outside of the CCT building, where we've replaced some plants and we're working with facilities with Indigenous plants. And then at the rooftop on the 3rd floor at the MN building, where we've added some planters, and that includes a range of things from squash to tobacco. All right, so I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maria. Our next speaker is Professor Jon Johnson, who is an assistant professor teaching stream at Woodsworth College in University of Toronto. His research focuses on urban land-based Indigenous knowledge in Toronto and its representation through oral and digital forms of storytelling. He is also interested in the ways that increases awareness of Indigenous presence in Toronto, and how it has informed Indigenous placemaking initiatives across the city. He works actively with Toronto's Indigenous communities in his capacity as a lead organizer for First Story Toronto, an Indigenous-led community-based organization that researches and shares Toronto's Indigenous presence through storytelling walks and digital initiatives such as website, smartphone application, and virtual tours.
Thank you very much, Con. Can you all hear me? Wonderful. Okay. Kudos to Maria for staying in time. Wow. This is going to be difficult for me too. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. And so I wanted to talk about thinking through this idea of the oral and the digital and the tensions and the sometimes incommensurabilities that can create, as well as the complementarities through the lens of some of the work that I've been doing through First Story Toronto, particularly in doing land-based storytelling. So, and then I'll end with some questions, I think, for everyone assembled, because these are things that are complex, and I'd like some of your input back on. So, by way of introduction, I'd just like to start off by talking about the origin of First Story Toronto, which started way back in 1995, primarily at the initiative of Rodney Bobbywash, who is an Anishinaabe scholar, community leader, activist, who at the time was really responding to the sort of lack of Indigenous presence, acknowledgement of Indigenous presence in Toronto. There was very little acknowledgement that Toronto was an Indigenous territory. So he started an initiative called the Great Indian Bus Tour of Toronto way back in the day, which was literally a 3-hour tour of places of Indigenous geography, history, significance, presence throughout the city. And it became a really, really important initiative that got people to recognize Toronto as a traditional Indigenous territory, and as a moment for creating conversations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples to create better understanding, because there was, and there still is, of course, racism and ethnocentrism and things that need to be countered. So that's the logo of the original bus tour from way back in the day. It's continued on after Rodney's unfortunate passing in 2002 with a lot of other folks in the community, myself included, but other professors at UofT like Dr. Karen Recollet, Dr. Jill Carter, elders in the community who are all, and youth too, and artists of various kinds, right? All of us are sort of contributing to this sort of like an ongoing storying of Toronto as an Indigenous territory. And so we have two main initiatives that are going on right now that we're really focusing our energies towards. One, of course, is the Indigenous Storying Tours or walks. Sometimes we're on a bus and sometimes we're walking, but also there's digital mapping initiatives that we've been engaged in too. And so this is where the work kind of comes out that I want to talk about today, this tension. So I want to start off by talking about this idea of a tour. It's not just a tour. It's a form, I would probably more accurately describe it as a form of urban Indigenous oral land-based storying. It's not just like a passive recital of stories, like some of you might understand storytelling to be. It's rather more, within Indigenous context, an active form of land-based engagement, of speaking with other than human relations and assembled witnesses in the places where those relations exist. And so it is a form of this land-based engagement. It's not just knowledge, it's the participation in the creation of that knowledge. And so it's very active as a form of communication. And I know that digital scholars are often used to thinking about the digital as being an active form of engagement. It's more active than reading and other kinds of media like that, more static media. But in terms of comparison to the oral, digital is actually a lot more passive in its engagement than the kinds of contexts that I'm talking about in oral storying. And our current focus is on promoting Indigenous community capacity, leadership and stewardship in Toronto, and ethical relationships with other than human beings in Toronto. And we've shifted our focus a little bit towards these things because we recognize, all of us that do this work, the power of story in sort of creating and transforming relationships in the city, orientations towards lands, towards relationships with Indigenous peoples in the more than human world, and the ways that work gets taken up increasingly in even very official organizations like the City of Toronto and universities and stuff like that. So we're trying to push in terms of thinking about how these stories, this oral tradition, these relationships can expand outward to create truly transformative projects and forms of engagement across the city. We also do various digital initiatives. For instance, there's this one or two that I'll share with you right now, and that's the First Story smartphone app, which unfortunately was ill-fated because it's no longer functional, and it's a contemporary iteration, which is in the what is now known as the Driftscape app. Both of them are free, searchable maps of stories of Indigenous presence and community across Toronto. The idea is that we wanted to find a way to address folks who couldn't be on tours, who couldn't go gather with us physically in person, to give them a sense of what this territory looks like as an Indigenous territory. So it was intended as a complement, but not a replacement to the in-person tours. And so it did become it has become a very valued resource amongst the community and in the schools in Toronto. But it's not perfect, right? It's in some ways troubling, and this is where I'm going to end with. This thinking about the relationship between the oral and the digital, and possibly the incommensurabilities that exist here. The thing is that even on regular tours that we do and walks that we do, there can be forms of unethical participation from people who haven't done their work, including things like voyeuristic and extractive practices that have always been an obstacle for the work that we do sometimes, but it's especially, I think, prevalent and potentially enabled through the digital mediation of things like story maps, which can often not invite the same kind of relationship. So I'm going to posit that digital mediation can, in fact, exacerbate unethical extraction of Indigenous knowledges, particularly through a colonial representation like a map, a format of a map, which sort of makes knowledges, Indigenous knowledges available, sometimes without really inviting the kinds of relationships and participation that oral knowledges and their sharing tends to invite much better and a much more greater degree. So I'm going to end on some questions. So is digital mapping and archiving of Indigenous knowledges alone ethically and pedagogically sufficient, given the participatory nature of oral knowledges and the possibility of extraction that these maps, particularly digital maps, because of their availability, can invite? Secondly, how can digital projects like this be reoriented to facilitate Indigenous futurity rather than simply archiving existing or even past knowledges? I guess the simpler question is archiving of knowledges simply enough? What's the relationship? And then finally, how can we take advantage of the benefits of digital formats like story maps, which I know are very common and prevalent and exciting in their possibilities, that can complement oral knowledges while somehow avoiding the unethical forms of voyeuristic extraction that they can invite and create. So these are kinds of the things that I'm working with a lot of us through First Story right now, and I'd like to, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on it too. So thank you very much, everyone. That'll be it for me. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Jon. I can tell already this is going to be a wonderful discussion. And our last speaker is Dr. Ravynn Stringfield, who is a scholar and author based in Virginia. She holds a PhD in American Studies from William and Mary and is currently a visiting assistant professor of media studies in the Rhetoric and Communication Studies at the University of Richmond. Her research interest centers Black women and girls as creators of and protagonists in new media and fantasy narratives. Ravynn is also a blogger, freelance writer, and novelist. She wrote the weekly blog Black Girl Does Grad School from 2016 to 2022, and her creative nonfiction has appeared in Midnight in Indigo, Shondaland, and Catapult. Notably, her ongoing column, Superhero Girlfriends Anonymous, is published by Catapult. Her book-length fiction is represented by Leah Pierre of Ladderbird Literary Agency, and her debut novel, Love in 280 Characters or Less, is forthcoming from Fywell and Friends, an imprint of Macmillan, in 2024.
All right, I guess that's my cue. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So I do not have slides for you all today. I just want to sort of briefly talk about some of those projects in a little bit more detail. And if you look in the chat, there are links for pretty much everything that I'm going to talk about. So please feel free to poke around and see what you can see. But essentially, I came to grad school wanting to work on Black women and girls in sort of comic books, sort of race and comic books. As time went on, it evolved into more of a Black girls in new media narratives writ large. And that in part came from my relationship to Black digital humanities. Black digital humanists saw what I was doing. They invited me into their networks, into their communities, and they showed me that what I was working on is in fact a very big part of Black digital humanities. The self-expressive work I was doing in the digital, the community building work I was doing in the digital, all of that contributed to sort of the larger conversations that they were already having in the Black digital humanities. So for example, I want to talk notably about Black Girls as Grad School, which was my weekly blog that I kept while I was in grad school. It started really as an attempt for me to sort of write down the things that I didn't understand that was happening in grad school, sort of reflect, sort of think through, sort of just record. I just wanted to record everything. I didn't exactly know what I was doing. And my thought was that if I recorded it, it would help me make sense of what was going on, help me push forward, and then possibly someone that came after me would find it useful as well. Black Girls in Grad School was essentially a self-blogging project, but by year 3, it ended up becoming much more of a community. I had a slate of guest writers that got involved with it. There were people who were guest editors on the blog, things like that. It turned into much more of a community thing because I was realizing that Black women and girls in graduate school needed that community support. Many of us were the only or one of 2 in our graduate programs. And so we were looking for that community aspect of grad school, and we were finding it online. And what was beautiful was that I was not the only person who was doing this. It was actually a very large number of Black graduate students who were building these online digital communities that I got very close with, notably Blackademia by Autumn Griffin and Tiffany Lee. And then there was also, there's still Black in Grad School by Alante Whitmore. All of us are graduated now, but we did come together around our respective projects. So that ended up being a 6-year-long project. I documented everything from coursework to my comps. All of my comprehensive exam lists are on the website. All of my dissertation updates, everything went into the blog. And as a result, realizing that blogging was a good effort for community building, I started to try to work with people in other aspects. So I ended up doing a podcast around Black fantasy with a friend, Bez Johannes, another scholar of Black fantasy. And then the last thing that I sort of wanted to talk about was while I was doing this project, talking and thinking about Black girls in digital and new media narratives, I realized that the work that I was doing, I didn't want to keep in the academy. I wanted to find a way to explore the themes in other projects. So the blog, the podcast, and then finally, I toyed with the idea of doing a creative dissertation, a mixed media novel told in text messages, blog posts, DMs, tweets about a Black girl's first semester in college where she's learning to navigate what it means to be a writer in a digital age. And of course, the self-identity aspect of that work that comes along with that. So essentially, it's a coming of age novel that I wrote with the intention of it becoming part of my dissertation. And I was very fortunate that my advisor looked at it, she read it, and she said, "This is great. I want you to go get an agent and sort of get represented for this. Not to say that this wouldn't be great for your dissertation project, but this is something that I think, you could get published." And so then that sort of catapulted me on my journey towards publication. I ended up working with an agent to sell that book to Firewell and Friends, and so yeah, so that's the sort of long, well, rather the short work of what I've been doing, and everything that I've talked about is here. Black Girl Does Grad School, the Goodreads link to 280 characters or less. And then the last thing that is there that might be of interest is I do actually write academic work on a lot of these issues as well. So I do have a peer-reviewed article in Digital Humanities Quarterly thinking about Black women and girls networking in grad school. So I think that's where I will leave it. Thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Ravynn. We'll open it up to an open discussion. Again, not just between our three speakers, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to open up your mic, drop your questions in the comment. I'll sort of start then. In trying to tie all of your presentations together, because all of you touched on that theme of community building, and I wonder, tying in Ravynn's with Jon's and Maria's, what does it mean for us to take our work outside of the academy? Does that help with that sort of ethical and way of doing DH, as Jon mentioned, or does it still encourage that voyeurism, that extraction of labor, and tying into what Ravynn said about creating digital networks among Black girls and women who don't always get that visibility, and the same would go with Indigenous students as well.
Maybe I can start with that. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I was living in Brooklyn, New York for about 9 years before I took the position at UTM. So part of the work I've been doing on campus has been getting to know what's there. And in a conversation I had with Joseph Pitawanakwit, who does a lot of work around traditional medicines, he says the first thing you want to do is introduce yourself to the trees, know their names. What are these trees, right? And so you can begin to have a relationship with place and with living beings outside of ourselves. And so that was kind of where I started in wanting to think about this idea of territorial acknowledgement, being back in Mississauga. I'm also an alumni of the campus, so I've seen a lot grow. So I had a lot of conversations with people, and that's really how it started for me. And then things kind of went from there. And I think the big development was the pandemic, right? So people were outside and then trying to take that into an online space. So, I'm really curious to hear, Rand, how you negotiate text online, and I'm really curious about some of those online spaces as well. But Jon, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally appreciate what you're saying there, Maria. And I think my comments sort of lead out of that as well and relate to that well. In the case of First Story Toronto, it's a community-based storytelling, and sort of the stories rest with community members first and primarily. So the problem is not bringing the knowledge from the university to the community, but rather when the knowledge is from the community and then sometimes gets cycled into contexts like the university that don't have the same politics of knowledge or understanding of what knowledge is for. And something that I was taught very early on was that, and I think I kind of tried to touch on this in my presentation, which is that within a lot of Indigenous contexts, we understand knowledge to be, its purpose is for living well in a particular landscape, in a particular place, and understanding what that entails, what those relationships are before acting, right? And that's not the same kind of politics or understanding or epistemology of knowledge that is in the university. So the very, very first thing that we have to do often when we're bringing knowledges into these other contexts is try to, in some ways, share the fact that, or create this understanding that the knowledge has a different purpose within Indigenous context, and it's inherently participatory in ways that are not just about sort of archiving the knowledge, the products of an ongoing land-based method of participation. It's actually the relationship itself. So so that's the trick, I think. And I think digital spaces too, we don't have the same kind of shared context. You know what I mean? Within an in-person sort of event where we can all see each other and we can all kind of gather in place, that kind of ethic is easier to create than it is online, unfortunately. So in as much as online allows us certain capacities that in-person events don't offer, that's a big one that the online or the digital doesn't offer or do very well, and is a major weakness for, I think, if you want to call it knowledge mobilization, but sort of sharing knowledge within Indigenous contexts. That sort of comes out of Indigenous contexts.
I think my response, or to sort of add to this conversation, is that yes, there are limitations, but I think that I think what's really been interesting in Black digital humanities is that sort of evolution of Black feminism, right? So we have Black feminism, we sort of think about hip hop feminism, and then we would talk about people like Catherine Knight Steele, whose arguments around digital Black feminism are directly coming out of that lineage. And I think the argument that these scholars might make, Catherine Knight Steele, Joan Morgan, I think our thought about these digital spaces is that you can in some ways replicate the sort of ethos of care and community building online. And I think part of the reason why that's true is because we have to. I think for a lot of us, our connections to people online are, they save our lives. I think in a lot of ways, I think of the mutual aid that Black feminists sort of go really hard on Twitter and on other social media platforms. It isn't, I think for us in some ways, and I'm also thinking about the ways that this is not necessarily I think a lot of us that are working on Black digital spaces in the academy are often not really thinking about the academy. Like, I think most of us are trying to think more about like what is possible within it, like what is possible within these digital spaces, and not sort of worry about or not even be thinking about what the specter of folks in the academy might say. And I think it's because so many of us have lifelines, like actual lifelines, built into our digital spaces. And so I don't want to say that some of the ethos can't be. There is a bit of it that really does need to be in person, but I think a lot of it can really be built out in the digital. And I think it's so the scholarship around that is actually really rich, not just Catherine Knight Steele, but Moya Bailey, Brooke Fuqua-Wells, and Sarah Jackson. They've all been sort of working on those sort of questions of like the life-saving stakes sometimes the digital can play for Black women and trans and queer folks.
And that's fantastic. Thank you for answering our question. I'm gonna just pop in here with an audience question from the chat as well. So Carlos says, thank you for your amazing presentations, which I definitely agree with. And Professor Maria Hupfield, would you be able to share more with us about the conversations you had around doing a medicine garden versus doing a more general Mchkiki garden?
Sure. Well, I guess it's more of a philosophical or approach. So I wanted to go back to drawing from Anishinaabe, which is the territory the campus is on, through our treaty partners, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. So really looking at the language and looking at the cultural reference points instead of just using English or colonial viewpoints. And I think that connects a little bit with what John's talking about in when we have a medicine garden, people's ideas of what medicine is and a garden is are very colonial in a lot of ways. So I wanted to move away from this idea of a garden that's extractive. And it just makes it a little more deeper. It makes people stop and think and take time with language, getting to know another language. A lot of our students on campus speak, or a lot of the students in my classes speak, 3 languages. They're second generation immigrants. It's very rich, very rewarding conversations that I have in class. And so it's exciting to introduce other languages with them, and it opens up a space for more discussion. So it's just really approaching it with an anti-colonial lens that's land-based and puts the land at the center. So when I have conversations with my students around, land back or territorial acknowledgement, it really centers it on land. And you can introduce writers like Dr. Robert Wall Kimmerer talking about, birding sweetgrass and planting, and really connect something like when we talk about growing corn, her chapter, and then literally go to the garden and plant some corn or harvest the corn. And then they're able to see it. And a lot of students, their relationship to even earth and what they think of is so limited. So it really expands things and makes it physical and real. And I just want to add, I think that connects as well with when I think of Indigenous literature, we're really looking at, with Indigenous literature, that we're really drawing from oral tradition, which is different than, this idea of to embody, to communicate, to share physically. This idea when you write things down to forget them, which is a whole different shift with the way we're taught within the institution, which is about your mind, maybe about your body, but not often about your spirit and your emotions. So wanting to bring all of that so we can fully be who we are in these spaces and on campus.
Absolutely. And so I'm really interested in how the digital can facilitate that kind of work, right? That kind of pedagogy, that kind of relationship. I think it can be complementary, but I think we have to be really, like, as DH scholars or people who enter into digital worlds or develop or design them, really careful about the architectures that we're creating. Because there's always a sort of a program, right? Within that program, there's an ethics that's implied within those programs, and they can trouble us if we're not careful, right? And how we develop those things. I think a lot of Indigenous folks are sort of sharing knowledges these days because, and it's not in all cases, but a lot of people that I've talked to have said that they're sharing knowledge because they want, and particularly when they're sharing with settler scholars or settlers, they want to help people to understand how to enter into an ethical relationship with more than human, with land, which is not appropriate of sort of just simply taking on Indigenous ways of doing things, but rather constructive of sort of developing their own relationships in this way so that they can have better relationships with land, which is, I think, important for all of us, right? Especially at this moment of climate change. So I guess the question is, like, what are the purposes, right? That the digital how does it work with this this ethic? What purpose is it for, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about archives as well as sort of not always being enough in and of themselves to do that, right? So thank you.
I think it also depends what the purpose is of the archive, who it's serving and who has access to it. So I really like the idea of the way that online content, like it increases accessibility, supposedly, right? It's connecting people. I think for the Indigenous community, in the same way that you're no longer the only person at an institution, whether you're a faculty member. Fortunately, that's not the case where I am, but in a lot of cases that is. So across great geography and land bases, we're able to connect, which is incredible. But I think that we have a couple of approaches that we're using with our archive project, sorry, my thing just bounced away. and that includes really centering the people, the voices. So having audio clips, having Google Maps so that we can see physically where the contents are coming from, including stories, interviews, like finding all these other strategies to move it away from being static. And I think that with maybe more in line with something like gaming or games, right, where there's a lot of dynamic information coming at us. So I'm really interested in a lot of those strategies, and artists like Stephanie Dinkins, who's doing incredible work with AI, and you know, anyway, so much.
I'll just say quickly, that's what I appreciated about both of your presentations, is that these are digital initiatives that are also about, in their own ways, relationships and creating relationships that are centered on activation and furthering of community futurity. That's the purposes of those things, those archives you mentioned. That's fantastic.
Maybe I'll jump in with, let me spotlight myself so you can see me. I'll jump in with a very short question for Ravynn. Very short, not so easy, but what's next? Like, do we have more publications coming? Are you working on more books? What can we look forward to?
Yeah, that is really fun, and a very dense question, actually. Like, so I got asked a lot while I was doing Black Girl Does grad school if I was going to like do a different blog once I finished grad school, for example. And I think one of the reasons that I ended up realizing I loved that blog so much was because it was in a lot of ways operating outside of the academy, outside, like people had there were a lot of academic eyes on it, but it was in no way intended to be something that was purposefully for someone to look at for a tenure file, or or thinking about like getting a job or anything like that. And so once I started like really committing myself to doing work that was very analytical and critical, and things that required deep thought and sort of rethinking what it meant to be a scholar and rethinking what it meant to be a critic, I sort of wanted to try to do things outside of academia. So I'm hoping now, moving forward, to do definitely more novels. So I've got some stuff working in the works for that. And as someone who studied a lot of media and did a lot of new media, I'm hoping to eventually write some comics. So I have some graphic novel scripts, sort of the same thing, like the sort of general interest in sort of Black girl self-making and what that becomes, and how the digital impacts how you see yourself and how you build self. I'm someone who like draws a lot of inspiration from Jessica Marie Johnson's Alter Egos and Infinite Literacies. I read that piece probably at least 2 times a year. Someone who really thought about what it meant to have all these different avatars and pen names online, and what that does when you grow up. And that's your norm. Like, you can reinvent yourself in the digital as many times as you want to. And so I want to keep building on that and keep thinking about that. And I'm hoping for novels. I'm hoping for comic books. I'm hoping to eventually do sort of a digital project that goes along with Love in 280 Characters or Less, because it is going to be a book. Like, it's going to be like a physical book. But because it is totally digital media, I'm hoping that maybe one day I can turn it into sort of a digital product that you can kind of like move through and see all of the digital artifacts come up, as opposed to just like a physical book. So those are the things that I'm hoping to do in the future.
That sounds very fleshed out already. I'm looking forward to it, especially a comic. But yeah, I'd never thought of using the digital sphere to reinvent the self, but it totally makes sense when you put it that way. We can have all these different names, all these different avatars and different personalities online. But yeah, that's definitely something for me to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let me just see, we have a message in the chat from Noah. Oh, sorry, this is not for the speakers. This is more for, yeah, Danielle's already answered that one. Okay, thank you, Danielle.
So as we're winding down our time, I think we need a longer session of this as possible. But I wanted to just get your final thoughts, because of all your presentations, we sort of explored the affordances and certain limitations of the digital, but it also seems very inevitable because as we progress, like Maria mentioned, tying anything to the digital automatically gives it some credence for being accessible and possibly more sustainable. And it seems like that's the inevitable path we're following, that increasingly we have to get into digital work. But at the same time, it doesn't always accommodate these systems of knowledge, from Black studies to Indigenous studies to LGBTQ study. There's a need for each field. So I think we're all striving towards that, the golden word of decolonization and anti-colonial practices. But it seems very hard to do, because even when, like Maria mentioned, something like video games, traditional video games is incredibly colonial in nature. So what are some of the ways you think we could sort of bridge this ethical, moral, and concerns that we have with taking things more digital?
I'm happy to start if that's okay with others. The last slide of the presentation that I was going to show was actually kind of addressing this. So I won't show the slide for time purposes, but one of the things that we had the fortune of doing, I think we were well positioned to do when the pandemic hit, especially because we were training new historian guides, new Indigenous students and youth, to sort of carry on this storytelling. And then the pandemic hit and we couldn't gather in person, is we were able to pivot towards the creation of virtual tours, in a sense, right? So to me, that's a situation where the technology creates an affordance that's better than a map, right? Than a story map, which sort of kind of just throws information at you for passive consumption. Because what you have then is, even though it's not context in the sense of like being able to gather, on the land together and sort of engage in that kind of relationality with place, you still get a sense of presence, and you still have, in the same way that we are through Zoom right now, the ability to talk to each other, see each other's faces, and check each other's understandings and further the conversation. So the virtual tour for me is sort of like a helpful use of technology that allows us to extend possibilities where physical gathering, for instance, isn't or wasn't possible or even desirable in some cases. You can still capture some of that sense of presence and some of that relationality. You can work with each other in ways that you can't when you're just presenting, a repository of knowledge for an audience to passively consume. So to me, that's like a useful intervention of technology that I think extends in-person oral engagements in a way that I think is decent, yeah, or helpful, promising.
I can go, Ravynn. We're looking at each other. There's sort of,
I don't have a response. Go ahead.
There's sort of two things that come to mind for me that come together. One is the work of Dr. Jennifer Wemmingwans with a book she has called The Digital Bundle to Protect and Promote. So to me, that ties in with the second part, which is about data sovereignty. So if we have the same types of people making all the data constructions and, really creating those structures, they're going to continue to build on those same structures of racism, gender, class that exist already and reflect that a certain limited worldview. And so it's about getting in there. So that's why I really love hearing Ravynn talk about some of the work that you're doing and other scholars as well. So that it's about like who is making it, who is owning it, what is it being used for, and that once you add those in, it changes the structure of those. So for me, to create an archive what's the collection, right? Is it, someone who grabbed a bunch of stuff at a point in time? Well, in this case, I'm the one who's grabbing all the stuff, and I'm deciding who, with, looking out there, what's going to be on there with my research team, and thinking, what are those items? And so then it becomes really exciting for me and makes me think about possibilities and dreaming. And I think the main thing is that we have the tools that we can do it, and the support from our institutions where we're based, so that we can decide what is public, what is private, and how to move forward.
Yeah, I think that maybe one of my main things that I would consider is that I feel like in terms of like getting support, one thing that I really want to make sure that I want to highlight here is that we have support for things that are playful. I think things that are joyful. I think that is also work that is critical to digital humanities work, especially the work that is going to be truly that's gonna be worth something, I think. And I really want us to prioritize sort of those playful relationships, the playful aspect of creating in the digital. Like, a lot of us end up in the digital humanities because we're tinkerers. We like to build things. We like to make stuff. We don't really care if we like if stuff doesn't work the first couple dozen times, like we're people that'll stick with it, and no matter what. And I think that the more that we sort of as institutions and things like that prioritize that desire to play and experiment and break things if necessary, and to find and to keep sort of pushing the intellectual value and the intellectual rigor that's necessary to do that sort of work. So I want us to, as we're thinking about like what's possible for the digital humanities, is to really continue to value, and when I say value, not just like verbally praise, but also financially support endeavors that are playful, that are creative, that are just I think that the sort of association with rigor and seriousness needs to be like deeply reimagined if we are going to sort of put our money where our mouth is with digital humanities as well. So that's what I will say to that.
Well, thank you so much. Can everyone give a physical or virtual round of applause for our three wonderful speakers, Maria, Jon, and Ravynn? And I'm just going to close here with some selfless self-promotion here. Our third lightning lunch is scheduled for November 15th on the topic of digital pets. So we will drop the registration link here if you are interested. We also have an upcoming event, which is on October 24th. We'll be running a praxis workshop on network analysis and visualization using the free and open source called Gephi from 2 to 4:30. We'll also drop the registration link there. And of course, we have CDHI also hosts a weekly digital drop-in, which happens every other Thursday from 1 to 2. We'll drop that link in there as well. And you can also visit our event page for upcoming digital humanities events. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. It was a wonderful discussion. And again, I think this should be in long form. If we can form a conference out of it, it would be even better. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your week. And thank you for being here right after the holiday weekend.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to talk with you, Maria and Ravynn. Good to see everyone.
Yes, you all are doing wonderful work. It was so great to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Much.
Thank you, folks. I'm going to stop the recording.